Okay, let's talk for a second about overcoming objections. And we talked earlier about how important it is to finish a sentence with a question. Oftentimes that's not something that's natural for many of us, but it's a very easy skill to learn, and it'll create the dynamic when you interact with somebody that you're the asking of the question person and they're the answering person. So let me give you an example of what would be called, say, a tie down. We're just going to go through a couple skills here, just so you have this weapon in your arsenal, if you will, and your ability to communicate with people, and I would recommend that you practice this. So a question at the end of a sentence demands them to say a yes. That's what a tie down is that when you ask a question, it kind of demands a yes from them. It's a natural yes kind of a question. So let me give you an example of that. If I were to say, Mark, Ursula, getting out of debt and saving more money just makes sense, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay, that's the difference between, thank you, by the way, that's the difference between saying, Mark and Ursula, it just makes sense to get out of debt, and I leave it there. That's a statement. But if I say, doesn't it, or isn't it, or couldn't it at the end of a sentence, or wouldn't it, that now turns that statement into a question, and now we've created that little dynamic as we're going of getting you to say yes to me. And I know this sounds very salesy, but it's true. Small yeses in a presentation typically lead to a big yes at the end. But if you're not getting little buy-ins, little yeses as you go, and you don't want to do it over and over and over again where it looks like a technique or a strategy. Again, the more you do it, the more conversational it becomes. But you can finish the sentence with a doesn't it, or couldn't it, or aren't you, that kind of a thing. Or you can open it. So you could finish the tie down by saying, you're open to earning additional income in new ways, aren't you?
Yes.
Okay, that's different than saying you should be open to earning additional income. That's a statement. And then they're going to say, well, how would we do that? Or why would we want to do that? But if I finish with a question, I start to get yeses. So you're open to earning additional income, aren't you? That's a yes. That's a yes answer. There's also something called an inverted tie down, which is you put the question in the beginning of the sentence. So I could say something like, Mark and Ursula, doesn't it make sense to get out of debt and save money?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you for saying yes. So I put the question in the middle or the beginning of the sentence, or aren't you open to looking at new ways of earning additional income? Hopefully the answer would be yes. And so I want you to learn finishing those sentences. I love to say things like, doesn't that make sense? That makes sense, doesn't it? Couldn't it? Wouldn't it? Shouldn't it? And learning to do that in your sentences rather than just respond with sentences. If you respond with a statement, they're going to respond with a question. So if I can finish my sentence with a question, typically they're going to respond with a statement, usually an affirmative, if I can ask the question properly. The other thing I want you to learn is just alternative of choice. Just learning to give someone the choice between two things that are both acceptable to you. That's a question with two answers. Either the answer is a minor agreement leading towards a major decision, but its best use is for time of appointments, locations, that kind of thing. You'll notice in many of our presentations at the end of the sentence they'll say, listen, I have a Monday or a Wednesday open. Which one of those would work better for you guys? And then they'll pick either one of them as appropriate. Or would 6 o'clock or 8 o'clock be better? Would 10% into your program or 15% be better? And so I want alternative of choice questions. It's very important that as you're asking questions of people that it not seem so canned. It's got to become, it's why you've got to practice it. It becomes more conversational. I actually have a habit in my real life now when I finish sentences often of saying, that makes sense, doesn't it? It's just because I've learned that that's how I influence people to move forward. The other thing I want you to find when you get an objection, when somebody objects, and by the way, a good presentation eliminates most objections throughout the presentation. But you do want a little resistance when you're finished, because an objection really isn't that. It's typically a question where they don't have enough information to say yes to you. That's really what it is. And so I like when the client, I don't want them to have 25 objections, but I like when I'm done that they ask a couple pointed questions to me, because that's indicative of the fact they're probably going to move forward, but they want me to make them feel a little bit more at ease about doing it. Now, when you get an objection from somebody, the natural human reaction is to answer it. Well, I've heard of WFG before, or I saw this on the internet, or we don't have enough money, or I already like my program. It's easy to say something, a statement, well, my gosh, that's not true about us. Let me tell you the truth. And what you've done now is you've begun to become confrontational. It's begun to become a debate, one in which you will not win. You will not win an argument or a debate with your consumer, with your client, with your customer. And so when you get an objection, I just want you to think this through. If you can just confirm the objection, and there's an old analogy that I wouldn't teach you to be too old school with this, but there's the old analogy of feel, felt, and found. When they give you an objection, you'll see this earlier, I could say, I know exactly how you feel about that. I felt the same way myself when that happened with me, but let me tell you what I found. And that's a way of saying, listen, I understand where you're at. I agree with it. In fact, same situation with my family. That's relatability. Let me tell you what I discovered. Let me tell you what I studied and found out. So when someone gives me an objection, I want to agree with them. I say, I understand where you're at. Believe me, I've been there myself. They may say something to me like, listen, we would love to move forward with this, but let me be honest with you. $300 a month is too much money out of our budget right now. Well, I could say something like, well, my gosh, don't you think you need to be able to afford $300 a month? I mean, and then it becomes an argument back and forth. Or I can say something like, listen, I understand that completely. Believe me, Christiane and I were in the exact same situation, so I know how you feel. We were in the same spot. Let me tell you what I discovered, though, about how important it is to be saving money for your family and how great it feels once you're doing it. And then we move forward. And it's a completely different dialogue and becomes a completely different conversation. So if you could learn just those three simple things, the three things are that you learn how to make statements that finish with questions at the end of your sentence or in the middle of it, that you begin to speak in a question sort of format as much as you possibly can. Two, if you learn that when you ask people to move forward, you give them two choices, both of which are acceptable to you. That's called alternative of choice. And if you could learn to just confirm objections and relate to that objection, it buys you the chance to now make your statement about what you found. The feel, felt, found, or I've discovered that myself, I know how you feel. That type of a confirmation of the objection that they give you. What we're going to do now in a minute is you're going to watch them object, the typical objections that you may hear in the field, and you'll see me use some of these strategies in overcoming those objections.